Good afternoon, everyone. And for those joining online, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Dustin Garrick, and I am a University Research Chair in Environmental Governance and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo and Research Fellow here at the University of Oxford. It's my pleasure, alongside Daniel Morchain of the Nature Conservancy, to welcome you to our session on nature-based solutions for food and water security. Our ambition today is to have a robust dialogue that draws on the insights and energy from the audience, both here in Oxford and from around the world. So I'd keep this introduction brief to offer us a roadmap for the discussions ahead. Over the past days, we have discussed nature-based solutions in the context of climate change and biodiversity loss, where agricultural systems and practices are drivers and priorities for transformation. Nature-based solutions for food and water security are far from new, however, traced to the practices of indigenous peoples around the world from time immemorial. It's in this context that water and agriculture need explicit attention in our discussions of the opportunities and limits of nature-based solutions to clarify which solutions can support the sustainable agricultural transitions that are needed, how and under which conditions, and their implications for and impacts on deep-seated inequalities, and finally, the strategies for scaling. When we started organizing this session in 2019 initially, it was on the heels of the UN's World Water Development Report, which focused on nature-based solutions for water resources management, concluding that although accurate figures were unavailable, data suggest that despite the increasing allocations to nature-based solutions in certain countries and regions, current direct investments in nature-based solutions appear to be less than 1% globally, and probably closer on the order of 0.1% of total investment in water resources, infrastructure, and management. In the time since, of course, interest in experimentation and investment has continued to increase, but the full potential for nature-based solutions will depend on the coordinated efforts and agenda that we advance together to better understand which nature-based solutions work where and how these can be identified, designed, and implemented with local partners and communities. So we're fortunate in this session to be drawing on a diverse and world-class group of scientists and practitioners who have been working actively on this agenda. I want to get straight to the agenda ahead and note that we'll be featuring a number of interventions that start with examining the status and trends for nature-based solutions for water and food security, identifying the different types of solutions, their synergies and trade-offs, and illustrating, importantly, these solutions via case studies with attention to the technical, governance, political economy, and financing dimensions. And overall, discussing in moderated panel the opportunities to form and strengthen existing communities for research and practice to ensure water-resilient food systems. Across this discussion, we'll be reflecting on the opportunities for scaling strategies and investment priorities. So let me turn straight now to the agenda ahead. We'll start with an overview of the status and trends from Professor Nandita Basu, who is a professor and University Research Chair also at the University of Waterloo. And I will turn it straight to Nandita in a moment and introduce the speakers who will follow her. And we want to remind our speakers and, of course, the audience that really is important that we stick to time and ensure the opportunities for the discussion throughout today's session. So we'll be providing updates with 3 minutes left for each of the speakers. And I would now, without further ado, like to welcome virtually Professor Basu.
Really honored to be here today and sorry to not be there in person. I wanted to talk to you today about a little bit of a mishmash with some of our earlier work and a really exciting new project that is starting up at the University of Waterloo with a network of academics across Canada, including Professor Dustin Garrick. And the goal of this project is to think about nature-based solutions for sustainable water and food transitions and thinking about these solutionscapes. And I'll talk to you throughout about this in my talk, but let me talk a little bit about the space from which I come from in here. The space from which I come from is the space of clean water and sanitation, thinking about synergies and trade-offs between various sustainable development goals. And specifically, if you think about water, water is really clean. related food, both in terms of you need adequate water to grow food, but also when you apply fertilizers and pesticides on the soil for growing food, it contaminates our water system and thus impacts our ability to maintain and provide clean water. And this is where a lot of the research in my group lies. We work on thinking about algal blooms, which are these green stuff that you see in our lakes and reservoirs all over the world in summer. And this is caused by and large by fertilizers that run off from our agricultural fields into our waterways. Algal blooms have been increasing in frequency and intensity over the last decade, and really impacting our fisheries, our local economies, our ability to use the waters for recreation purpose. A recent paper that came out talked about increasing algal blooms specifically in countries like India and China, where fertilizer applications were increasing exponentially. And of course, water and food is intimately related to energy and climate action. When you grow food, that has an energy cost associated with it. And energy and water are related. So the thinking about our nature-based solutions comes at this interplay of water, food, and energy. And if you think about kind of focus on the energy part of it, thinking about natural climate solutions. So there's been some recent work that has focused in the space of natural climate solutions. And both the top paper that you see that came out in PNAS and the paper in Science Advances that was done in a Canadian context, these papers estimate what is the greenhouse gas the climate mitigation potential of various land use practices, various nature-based solutions, thinking about agricultural lands, wetlands, grasslands, and forests. The main takeaway that I wanted you to take from this is a lot of these estimates are done in a spatially lumped way. So you take all the wetlands across Canada and you estimate what is the total potential for these wetlands for climate mitigation. We do not take into account a lot of times in these estimates the spatially explicit nature of this phenomenon. So a wetland in one location is not the same as the wetland in another location. And that is one of the entry points into the work that I'll talk to you about. So bringing you back to this idea of solutionscapes, our goal is to think about nature-based solutions for sustainable water and food transition, specifically working on these agricultural landscapes. So if you think about agricultural landscapes and nature-based solutions, on one hand, you have this portfolio of various conservation agricultural practices, cover crops, tillage, so we'll be looking at that. You also think about manure. Manure has both air quality, greenhouse gas emissions, water quality impacts. So we will explore manure to bioenergy options. And finally, we'll also talk about wetland protection and restoration, which is normally not thought about in conjunction with agricultural lands, but there's a ton of wetland restoration that goes on to capture agricultural runoff. So we'll think about them in conjunction with agricultural lands because they become a part of this solution for our agricultural practices. For today's talk, I'll focus primarily on the wetland piece, but the ideas in that piece is what we are following through in both the two other pieces too. So jumping right into wetlands, here's a paper that we did a few years ago, kind of trying to think about wetlands as large-scale nature-based solutions and how do you think about the challenges for research and engineering. And wetlands provide a whole host of ecosystem services. One of them, which we will talk about today, is the service of removal of excess nutrients and improving downstream water quality. Now, while we know that wetlands remove nitrogen and improve the quality of downstream waters, what is really not known is how much. So in this work, which was done across continental US, we asked the question, how much nitrogen is removed by wetlands across US? Really simple question. So in order to do that, we first started out doing a large meta-analysis where we gathered data from hundreds of wetlands across the world and developed some empirical relationships that I will not bore you with that estimates nitrogen removal in wetlands as a function of things like wetland size, location, etc. And then we took a wetland map across US that maps out all the wetlands. And using that map, we estimated the nitrogen removal potential of wetlands. So 50% means 50% of the nitrogen that's coming into the wetlands is removed by the wetlands. And of course, the darker purple areas where you see high percent removal are also areas where you have a large number of wetlands. That's not surprising. But the question that we then asked is, will these wetlands really remove a lot of nitrogen? If you have a wetland in a pristine forested area, it's not getting that much nitrogen because it's not draining farmland. So will it remove as much? And here is where the next and more novel part of the work comes into play, linking nitrogen sinks in the landscape with sources of nitrogen. We did a very fine scale mass balance of inputs of nitrogen across the country and came up with the various components of nitrogen inputs in agricultural landscapes. That's how that looks like without going into great detail. The red areas are where you have high inputs of nitrogen. In the US, the red area is the Mississippi River Basin where a lot of agriculture is focused, and it drains into the Gulf of Mexico, which is well known for its problems with hypoxia. Gulf of Mexico gets hypoxic every summer and impacts fisheries and local communities there. So using these two sinks and sources, we estimate what is the mass removed by nitrogen, mass of nitrogen removed. And we found that across the US, there is 0.86 teragram of nitrogen that is removed. What that means is that without existing wetlands, the nitrogen loads that is coming to the Gulf would be 50% higher than it's now. And this is really important because there's huge amounts of efforts to reduce the nitrogen loads to the Gulf. So if we lost the current wetlands, that is the impact that we would see in terms of hypoxia. We then moved forward to ask that next question: how can wetland restoration contribute to improvement in water quality? And here we did different scenarios. In the first scenario, we said we'll increase 10% in terms of area. And then we will do it randomly across the country. So you see wetlands in green are all across the countries except in mountains and deserts. We put wetlands everywhere. Second scenario, we said we will not lose any agricultural land. And here you see that the Mississippi River Basin, where there was a lot of agricultural land, those don't get that many wetlands. And finally, the last scenario is same percent increase in area, but here we are restoring wetlands in those hotspot areas where there is high amount of agricultural land. And that's why those pop up as blue. So what does that mean in terms of nitrogen removal? If you look at the map at the figure on the right, the x-axis is the increase in wetland area and the y-axis is increase in nitrogen removal. So we did it for different percent increase in wetland area. And what you see is that targeted wetland restoration can reduce up to 40 times more nitrogen than non-targeted restoration. Of course, it's not cheap because when you're restoring wetland on agricultural land, that land costs more. But what we found was that the cost was only twice that of non-targeted restoration. And the cost was, in fact, quite commensurate with the money that is spent in the US for various conservation programs. Now, note, we are not talking about taking large swaths of agricultural land and changing that. We are talking about restoring small wetlands in low spots of agricultural fields to capture the nitrogen that runs off from the fields. Now, to summarize that, what we found that a targeted 22% increase in wetland area can result in approximately a 40% decrease in nitrogen loads, bringing us closer to some of the policy goals that have been set for improving water quality in the Gulf of Mexico. And most importantly, the story doesn't end there. This is just one benefit of a wetland. Wetlands also sequester carbon. They also provide flood protection. They improve biodiversity, but they can also increase methane emissions. So that is a trade-off that you have to think about for wetland restoration. So let me talk you through another example with this. Here's a little bit of a story for this one wetlands in the Greater Toronto area, which is where we live in. And this is an urban wetland that in 2020, right at the start of COVID, there was a conversation of it being paved over for an Amazon facility. And the government, when they were making this call for paving over this wetland, their argument was that they had some environmental consultants do a report on this wetland, and it turned out that the biodiversity metric in this wetlands was really poor. And this is really important. A wetland in an urban area or an agricultural area is not probably as diverse biologically as a more natural wetland. And this led to a few of us getting together and writing an op-ed, making the point that a wetland in an urban area is valuable because even if its biodiversity metric is lower than a wetland in a more pristine area, it provides a lot of flood protection and water quality benefits that a wetland in a pristine area would not. So when you're thinking about wetland restoration, if I want to work with water quality, I restore only wetlands in agricultural area. If I care about biodiversity, I go in and restore wetlands in more natural areas. The most important thing in this space is to think that there are important trade-offs in the landscape. And when we design these solutionscapes, we have to think about these trade-offs. Another trade-off is climate mitigation. And here again, there's a whole host of controversies. Some say wetlands are carbon sinks, others say no, they can be carbon source because of the methane emission. And this brings to what we are proposing to do in this project. We are talking about figuring out what are the key trade-offs associated with wetland restoration in agricultural landscapes, what are the spatial patterns of restoration that can lead to the greatest synergies, and how can policies and incentives be designed to ensure greater farmer participation in wetland restoration, and bringing together this kind of top-down approaches, which was the focus of my talk, looking at these large-scale maps, figuring out what the best restoration scenarios are for different objectives, but also moving from the bottom up. So we will do a lot of farmer consultation, visioning, landscape visioning, to think about what is the perfect combination or what are the optimal configuration of these different practices that create these solutionscapes. Jumping a little bit into another practice, again, where there is trade-offs. So no-till agriculture has been valued, and it's a good climate solution because you keep the carbon in the soil when you do no-till agriculture, but it has also been shown to increase nitrate loss and dissolve phosphorus loss. So again, we ask the question, what are the trade-offs, and where do we put these practices in what way to optimize these trade-offs and create more win-win scenarios? So to summarize, the key takeaways that I wanted to take away from this talk is that there's co-benefits and trade-offs in any of these nature-based solutions, and they need to be explicitly quantified. And these are spatially and temporally explicit. So it is not enough to say, well, this is bad or this is good. It is location specific, and we need to quantify them in that way. And then finally, we have to think about incentive mapping and coordination for better adoption and of these trade-offs at different scales. With that, thank you so much for your time, and would love to have questions or send me a message.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Basu, and a masterclass in sticking to time with 1 minute to spare. Okay, setting out important themes that will resonate and be revisited in the panel discussion. So thanks again, Nandita. And now I'd like to invite and welcome Susan Chomba, who is Director of Vital Landscapes for Africa at World Resources Institute, who will also be joining us virtually and giving us a 10-minute overview of her work on food systems perspective and an entry point from the active work on the ground in Africa across the continent. Over to you, Susan. Welcome.
Thank you, Dustin, and a really big pleasure for me to be part of this conference. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm also equally very sad that I can't be there in person, but delighted that I can be able to share perspectives from some of our work on food systems and NbS in Africa. Now, perhaps to set the stage, the latest report on food and nutritional security that was recently released indicates that at least we have 768 million people who faced hunger in 2021. This is basically more than 46 million people who faced hunger in 2020. And the report, I should quote, should dispel any lingering doubts that the world is moving backwards in its efforts to end hunger, food insecurity, and malnutrition in all its forms. And so nature-based solutions in this particular case come to mind. in terms of how they are implemented and the role that they play in food systems transformation. Perhaps let me make three critical points here. The first one, that it is impossible to address climate change, both mitigation and adaptation, without fixing the food systems. We know that it's estimated at least a third of total greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to food systems, including the production, the way we produce food, the land use changes, and especially the impacts that agriculture has on natural ecosystems, such as forests, peatlands, and other rich areas that are rich in biodiversity, and including the whole process of food systems from storage to transport to packaging, processing, retail, and consumption. And add on to that food loss and food waste. So the whole food systems, it's bigger than just food production. And yet we know very well that massive increases in food supply since perhaps the 1960s to feed a growing population have involved a much greater use of nitrogen fertilizer, as well as use of water in irrigation, at least 100% increase in terms of water use. Climate change in turn threatens food security, increasing frequency and severity of both droughts and floods. As we are speaking in the Horn of Africa right now, we have at least 20 million people who are estimated to be facing food and nutritional security, and really understanding that business as usual in terms of our food systems massively contribute to climate change, but also is affecting people's food security. The second point I'd like to make is that it's impossible to address biodiversity loss without fixing the food systems. WRI report on cropland area expansion that was released earlier this year shows that we have cropland expansion continuously happening in Latin America and Africa, and agriculture continues to be the biggest driver. Agriculture is a major driver for unprecedented biodiversity loss, with at least 1 million species at risk of extinction. And this rate of extinction is increasing every year. We are also seeing that at least 64% of agricultural land globally is at risk of pesticide pollution, causing adverse effects on water, biodiversity, and human health. This is estimated that at least $500 billion in annual crops are at risk from pollinator loss. And so again, agriculture becomes a big compounding effect when it comes to biodiversity loss, and nature-based solutions here, we need to see what it can be able to offer. So let me make a proposal and perhaps give an example around where nature-based solutions offer a clear pathway for building resilient food systems while addressing both mitigation and adaptation, as well as biodiversity loss. And I'll do that by demonstrating or providing one key example that WRI has been leading with partners, of course, have been leading on the African continent, which is a landscape restoration, basically catalyzing broad-based landscape restoration across the African continent through the AFR 100 initiative. That's the African Forest Restoration Initiative. This is a country-led process to restore at least 100 million hectares by 2030, coinciding with the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. And just to mention here that why a nature-based solution in landscape restoration is critical, because of course, land degradation, at least 25% of our current land is estimated to be degraded in Africa. It's almost 60% of agricultural land that is estimated to be degraded. This includes soil erosion and reducing soil organic carbon content with attendant consequences for soil structure, water holding capacity, and biota that are quick to happen, but take very long time to reverse. Climate change, of course, exacerbates degradation through high temperatures and increasing frequency and severity of droughts, as I mentioned, and floods. And in many places, water tables are lowering because of the amounts of groundwater extracted and surface water abstracted for irrigation in order to feed our agricultural systems. We heard from Professor in the beginning session, a very strong case there in terms of nitrogen and its impacts that is coming from agriculture and its impacts on water bodies. So landscape restoration can help us to address this, and nature-based solution is one of the key methods that can be able to do it. However, the way we currently conceptualize nature-based solution, and especially what we are seeing through tree planting and tree growing, can have either positive or negative effects on food production. And this is where really the kind of nature-based solutions that we are that different actors, different stakeholders are really pushing need to be carefully evaluated and carefully working together with research organizations, research partners, and academic institutions to evaluate the kind of impacts they're having on food production. I'd like again to point, for instance, when we restore landscapes with a very strong focus on carbon sequestration and therefore growing fast-growing species, sometimes even more, in most cases, exotic species that we've seen dominate the landscape restoration on African continent, can have severe and negative impact on food security. And therefore, this presents a case where you can have a negative impact on food security from nature-based solutions. We have cases, for instance, that are well documented, the Grain for Green program in China, where basically you're seeing very rapid increase in terms of the above ground vegetation and above ground carbon sequestration, but negative effects on hydrological functions, because the fast growing exotic species will also be very demanding in terms of the water that they consume, as well as now having that negative hydrological effects on the crop productivity. And so, on the other hand, nature-based solutions can have a very, very positive effect on food. And I think, again, Professor mentioned perhaps some of the contested areas such as regenerative agriculture, where we're seeing some of the practices such as cover crops, no tillage, and a use of cover crops, no tillage, or rotational cropping really having significant effect on crop productivity. But also there exists scientific challenges in terms of how much carbon those practices are able to sequester on their own, how much claim we can put in terms of on climate change mitigation through carbon sequestration of regenerative agriculture. It is important that we develop evidence, clear evidence, so that we are making policy and implementation decisions based on evidence. And so I'd like to suggest that, in fact, when you have a tree component bringing in, then there's no question around, because there's solid evidence around the ability of trees, and especially when you use indigenous trees, trees that are able to integrate well with crops, which are not competing with crops. In Africa, for instance, you have tree species such as acacias, the Fidelbia albida, that have been shown to have reversed phenology and therefore do not compete with crops when it comes to light, and therefore can have positive effect in terms of crop productivity. Also, we've seen evidence in terms of the ability of trees to really act as hydrological pumps to pull water from below grounds where crop roots cannot be able to reach, and therefore availing that moisture for crops. And last but not least is obviously trees that are able to fix nitrogen, leguminous tree species that are able to fix nitrogen, and also the ability of trees, of course, to sequester carbon and put it in the biomass as well as in the soils. So there are a combination of aspects here that can be able to show nature-based solutions having positive impacts on food production and of course, food production, but of course we have to be aware in terms of the likely negative outputs, negative outcomes from it. Last but not least, of course, is the overall impact that nature-based solutions, and especially those that involve tree, can contribute beyond the crop productivity in household security, and in fact, in areas that perhaps are more gender sensitive in terms of ensuring that we have, for instance, food trees, as well as increase in income at household level. So we have a combination from landscape restoration practices that we've been practicing, that we've been learning, and I'd like to encourage other actors who are working in this space, nature-based solutions, to be aware of this and to work closely so that we are learning as we are doing and not committing, practicing or supporting activities that could end up being extremely detrimental to food productivity. Last but not least, let me submit that, of course, it is important to overcome some of the challenges that we've been seeing in nature-based solutions, such as financing, because there's a huge time lag between investing in practices, nature-based solution practices, especially in food production, and then the returns. So we need to ensure that farmers are getting the incentives that they require, financing nature-based solutions with understanding that the returns of those might come way, way longer after the farmers have been practicing, putting these practices in action. And also designing them in a way that they are locally led and that they are designing, the farmers have agency and they have decision-making power in terms of how nature-based solutions are being implemented in their own localities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Susan, and for such a forceful finish and emphasizing a theme that's been recurring over the last days about the importance of empowering farmers and giving agency in terms of how nature-based solutions are designed and implemented. I now have the chance to move from the kind of systems and overview of status and trends that we've been getting from the water and food perspectives to a set of case studies. And first, inviting Mauricio Castro Schmitz, who is the Regenerative Agricultural Director for the Nature Conservancy, who'll be speaking on the viability of agriculture through nature-based solutions. Welcome, Mauricio.
Okay, my name is Mauricio Castro Schmitz, I was mentioned. I work in Latin America. I'm from the region. I'm Colombian, actually. I'm going to talk about trying to bring our cases that we work in the Nature Conservancy for many years from the ground up. How do you actually scale using a systems approach and bringing that into practice? I'm going to work also through a case in Colombia, where I'm from, on sustainable grazing or sustainable ranching. I want to also mention that the work that we're doing in the last few years in Latin America is innovative for the Nature Conservancy. We have worked in Latin America first. Now we have a global strategy on regenerative food system, but it's actually from the ground up. So a lot of the cases that I'm going to talk is about bringing what we have seen in the field in different locations throughout the region. So why food? Why is an environmental organization worried about food? Food is maybe the way through which we interact most with nature and environment. No, we touch water, soil, biodiversity, carbon. Everything is sort of affected by food in a way. This is a farm close to my hometown, Cali. Actually love the area. You see sugarcane in the back, regenerative sugarcane in the back. You see, instead of using herbicides, they're using these African sheep, hairy sheep, to be the herbicide in the region. That system works at scale, over several hundred hectares of sugarcane with this kind of system. But food is important for TNC to focus on, because through food we can actually solve many of the issues that are affecting what we care about. And we're trying to bring an integrated approach to this. So this slide for me is also very important, because it simplifies in a way why we're doing this. But if you look at the orange countries, try to think yourself in crunching everything that is being used for livestock in Latin America into countries. That would be the area from Mexico to Bolivia. So we use about 40%, an estimate, this is our estimate, of our region for livestock. Highly degraded, highly inefficient, with lots of opportunities for improvement. Around the size of Argentina is what we use for crop. And around this size, about the size of Brazil and the Guyanas, is what's left in forest. Just to take one, I'm just simplifying here. This is a region that is so important, several biodiverse countries are in Latin America, but it's also the biggest net food exporter in the world. So we export a lot of food, it's only going to grow. More soy, more meat, that's going to happen. To simplify this, either we grow into the green or the orange, just to make it simple. Either you use more habitat, natural habitat, and open that up, or you restore a lot of the degraded soil that is under pasture, bad managed pasture, and restores soil for production. And 50% of the land is, as I said, mostly degraded, but also highly inefficient. You can have twice or three times the production of the orange of livestock that you have today. A lot of opportunities there. We've used the term regenerative because that sort of talks to the nature-based solutions in agriculture. What is it? Nitrogen, more phosphorus, all those cycles, creating more biodiversity, more biomass, more carbon in the soil, above soil. So those solutions bring them to the sector. And what we have done with the region, I work at regional scale, but I work with my colleagues in the field and partners, a lot of different partners we work with. We just simplified and sort of streamlined a strategy. And that strategy is about working with different sectors. So we have the idea is to work with the agriculture sector. You got to work with the companies who are affecting large areas of natural ecosystems, creating better business models on regenerative agriculture, working with governments to create better policies, an umbrella of supporting the transition to regenerative agriculture. And we think, just to simplify this again, it's not only about nature, it's about people as well. This doesn't work if people are not better off, making better margins in their income, having better livelihoods, and also being more resilient to El Niño and La Niña effects, which are drought and a lot of water during the year. So that's important for us. So wind for the sector is also important. One of the things that is important, as mentioned here, I want to talk about this. Moving from mainstream agriculture, which only focuses, of course, you know this, on production and gains, to some of the best agriculture practices is nice. You might have some good outcomes on carbon, on water, here and there, but we're aiming to really work on a more integrated fashion at the landscape approach. It's not about farm to farm. It's how do you restore a network of areas for conservation? How do you actually include all the different elements, social, environmental, and production elements into this sort of picture together and production, and moving into what we call ecosystem-based adaptation in the agricultural sector. So we're moving, it's a straight line. Practices are nice, no? But they're not sufficient. You have to have a more holistic and comprehensive approach. A landscape can look like this. You have production systems that are interlinked. You're conserving your water sources. You're conserving a network of patches that are important for maintaining biodiversity, and also having different production systems. These are the landscapes that we're working with, mega landscapes. Obviously, that's the ones that are important for us. We're focusing on 4 at the moment: the Chaco here in Argentina and Paraguay, highly marked for agriculture expansion. Araguaia Valley, Cerrado, the Llanos in Colombia, the Magdalena Valley, and we worked a lot here in Central America and Chiapas. Those are different landscapes, 15 of them where we think this strategy should be aimed at scaling using a systems approach thinking. Just to finish up, these are real cases from Colombia, ranching, trying to change the ranching industry, ranching federation in Colombia, Fedegan. We worked over 10 years with over 4,000 ranchers, and this provided amazing prototypes on how to scale regenerative agriculture. Different locations in the country, different regions, but still not moving the needle. I bring this up because you can see from the regenerative models here, intensive silvopastoral systems, you get much more animals per hectare. This is average data on these 4,000 areas, more milk production, and most importantly, more forage, more biomass. You can do this. So we have shown that this is possible at scale. We need to bring this to other locations, but this is one of the different cases that we work with in terms of ranching. We think you got to fix ranching first because that's where you have the opportunities. There's a lot of area for ranching. And we also think that we need to create something that tells us, are we moving in the right direction? Are we transitioning to regenerative? We think that something like a regenerative index could help us in that direction. And having a combination of environmental, social, and production elements together. So that's something that we are working on. I don't know how I'm doing on time. I have one more thing to say. I'm okay? One thing that we're doing, and a bit of talk about that, we were able to present this strategy to the German government. So we were starting, actually last month, we started a large ICI, International Climate Initiative project in 5 of these countries. And that's about bringing this to scale. And it's not only one solution. It's not only finance or capacity or gender. It's the combination of factors. And we're trying to bring this in Argentina, Colombia, Paraguay, Ecuador, and Peru. And we're going to have a 6-year journey to develop this, try this, and scale these approaches from the ground up in these different landscapes that I mentioned. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, that was a great presentation. Could you just comment briefly on the governance structures and how you've managed that trans-boundary, trans-country at that scale, how that's played out in terms of incentives for ranch owners and the sort of supply chain?
So I wasn't able to talk about all the details, but one of the elements to your question is creating platforms of multi-stakeholders. That's the only way we think we can scale. And that's where you bring the Federation of Ranchers of Colombia or of Argentina. You bring INTA or our Colombian Institute, AgroSavia. You bring all these different players together. You bring companies. And one thing that is interesting, creating the policies as an umbrella for governance, creating the right policies, you need to have ministries of environment and agriculture talking to companies and producers. That doesn't happen. We want to create those spaces through this large project as well. But it's about a platform approach of scaling, a regional one, but also landscape level ones that we need to create.
Thank you very much. We will be interested in building on this and digging in further during the panel. We're doing well to keep that time, so I want to continue now on our session. We have 2 more presentations before moving into a moderated panel. And next I'd like to invite virtually to join us Sophie Tremolet, who is Water Security Director for the Nature Conservancy for Europe, and she'll be discussing their work and case study of investing in nature for water security in Norfolk and Eastern England. So welcome, Sophie. We have 10 minutes. Over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dustin, and good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can see my screen. I'm also sorry I couldn't join you in person, but I hope we have the opportunity to engage other questions. So Nandita mentioned the need to go to, look at what happens from the ground up. This is exactly what we're going to do in this presentation, is look at an example of a multi-stakeholder platform that we are setting up in order to invest in nature-based solutions at scale in a part of the UK, which is not very far from Oxford. It's in Norfolk, in East Anglia. And here what we are doing is that we are effectively in the process of setting up what at the Nature Conservancy we refer to as the water fund model, which are loosely defined as organizations that can establish financial and governance mechanisms to bring stakeholders together around a common plan to tackle water security challenges through nature-based solutions. So this is at the heart of the discussion in this session. And this type of work requires addressing issues of governance, of science, of course, in order to be able to define these prioritized action plan, but also tackling issues of financing, identifying how can we pull different revenue streams in order to invest in this prioritized investment program, and of course, leading therefore to implementation. So the Nature Conservancy has contributed to creating numerous such structures, water funds, which in each case have a different name, of course. The first experience was in Latin America. It was in Ecuador, in the Paramo, just sitting above Quito, and Quito had an issue with the Paramo being degraded by agricultural practices, and therefore saw the need for establishing such a water fund in order to invest in restoring the Paramo, which is a very large wetland in the Andean region, a zone of wetland. So since then, we've worked in 13 countries with 41 water funds created to date, but with more under preparation. And we have capitalized on this knowledge and experience in a number of guides and toolbox. I've put here links to, for example, the water funds toolbox, or to how to guide an investor guide that were recently published jointly with AFD or the World Water Forum, for example. We've also set up a technical assistance facility. I think my screen might be cut, but it's what we refer to as the Nature for Water facility that helps implementers in the field design this kind of prioritized investment programs and associated governance and funding arrangements. So in Norfolk, this is precisely what we are doing. Norfolk is the little bit here that is very red on the map, where irrigation intensity is greatest in the UK. And in this region, we have joined forces with the local government, the Norfolk County Council, the water company, Anglian Water, and Water Resources East, which is a platform for helping with prioritization of water resource allocation in the region. And we chose this region because intensified agriculture and urban development creates significant water security challenges. So the goal of what we refer to as the Norfolk Water Strategy Program is to scale up investments in nature-based solutions to achieve a number of goals that are set out above, mainly ensuring that water is not a barrier to sustainable economic growth, but also with the objective of increasing resilience and delivering water-related climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. This region is facing a number of issues. So one of the first things we had to do was to identify which are the most pressing issues, because it's a perfect storm, if you want, of water security challenges, ranging from water resources, availability with a rise in groundwater abstraction from chalk aquifer, which feeds very sensitive chalk streams, which have a high in biodiversity value and only present in this part of the world. And it's combined with water quality issues linked to nutrients from intensive agriculture, flood risk, physical modification, etc. So originally the impetus for the work came from the fact that there are pressures on groundwater abstractions, and some parts of the county, this is a representation of abstraction in the county, are effectively looking at abstraction licenses being withdrawn from farmers, particularly in the Bure, where you see a very high percentage of agricultural abstraction. But there are also a lot of abstractions that take place above this chalk stream aquifer, which is highlighted here. There are also an issue related to nitrates, nitrate vulnerable areas, which have meant that in the last few months, the government has decided to effectively de facto stop all infrastructure development until nutrient neutrality can be achieved. So whereas we started with a focus on water quantity, we're very much pivoting towards addressing as well nutrient neutrality as one of the key objectives for this work, because it's such a high pressing issue. So what are we doing? We're defining a water strategy that captures all these challenges, but which will center on effectively establishing two types of governance platforms and funding mechanism. One is a collective action platform to coordinate efforts and develop NbS to tackle those challenges in Norfolk, with this range of activities, facilitated experience sharing, disseminated best practices, developing KPIs, conducting joint research, for example, on the potential that NbS have to tackle water quantity challenges. But in parallel to that, we are setting up a more dedicated investment fund, the Norfolk Water Fund, to leverage and coordinate funding for the delivery of specific NbS programs. And this is where we are going to focus on addressing nutrient neutrality in particular. So the objective of this work is to then attract multiple revenue streams into this, including payments from developers, for example, who have to achieve those targets. So we've been working on a number of reports which are very hands-on and setting out those challenges, but also laying out, for example, a catalog of nature-based solutions that can address those challenges, going into detail about what the likely I've mentioned, but also with stakeholders to understand what they need, how to work together, because this is an area where there is work underway. We are, for example, supporting a project, the Wendling Beck Environment Project, led by 4 farmers, which is very innovative and mobilizing multiple revenue streams from biodiversity net gains, nutrient credits, also soil carbon credits, and the reformed ELMs, so effectively agricultural subsidies that are all combined into supporting that project. So there is a lot of different initiatives taking place. We also set NbS visualization tool so that partners can see who's doing what where and can start moving towards a more integrated and prioritized investment program. So the types of solutions that we are focusing on are, first of all, solutions that can regulate flows, reduce pressures on ecosystems, so as to extend abstraction periods and mitigate flood-related issues, slowing the flow, improving landscape-scale storage, and restoring hydrological connectivity. But as I said, we've also looked at solutions that can have water quality benefits. So effectively, we're looking at building a package of interventions that includes interventions that can address both of these challenges. And constructed wetlands here, you have an image from one program that has been built in Norfolk, is the Ingle desktop wetland, which effectively addresses water quality issues at the exit of a treatment plant. So these are the sort of activities that the Norfolk Water Hub will undertake. And the Norfolk Water Fund being, as I said, a mechanism for attracting funding from multiple sources and deploying that in a strategic manner. These are examples of the solutions which are already underway as part of the Wetland river and creation of wetlands for removing nitrogen from the landscape. So I'm getting to the end of the presentation. I think some of my take-home messages are that NbS indeed can play a significant role in improving the management of societal challenges such as water security and restoring biodiversity. But to maximize their impact, it's important to work from the ground up in order to develop these investment programs. One needs to be very clear about the role they can play, not oversell NbS, develop those priority investment plans in a way that is complementary to grey infrastructure investments. Also identify multiple sources of revenue. I've made references to some of them that are available in the UK, but also very importantly, put in place the governance structures that enable greater collaboration between multiple actors and mobilization of funding at the scale that is required. And here you have my contact, and I think I stuck to time. Thank you, everybody.
That was brilliant, Sophie. Thank you so much. And good to see this example of embedding nature-based solutions within the wider strategy and planning processes and the collective action initiatives needed to coordinate at scale. So before turning to the panel, last but not least, I am very delighted to welcome Ina Porras, who is serving as Economics, Climate, Environment Advisor for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, who will be talking about the office's programs on investing in nature for water and food security. So welcome to Ina, and again, 10 minutes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. And it's very exciting to be here. And I'm going to be talking about all the reasons why we should be optimistic about what the UK government is doing, and especially on nature. I'm going to bring it down on food and water as well. But there are three points especially that I want to be making today. The first one, we have £3 billion that have been committed for nature under our climate commitments and the ODA strategy. So that's our first one. I will go more in depth into this one. The second one is everything that we're doing and now at full speed to institutionalize our commitments for nature. So we need to make sure that all of this is really, really locked into the system and be proof to any of the changes that happen all the time at high speed in the government, so whichever government is at the moment. And also, I want to briefly mention the big work that goes on expanding and maximizing these diplomatic systems to really push forward the ambition across other governments and in global systems to really set forward nature, and all the resources can only get you very little into what we really need to mobilize these many millions. So really important, this is really exciting in here, this £3 billion commitment for nature. So this, as you know, the UK government allocates about 11 billion pounds a year as overseas development assistance to support countries in humanitarian, girls and women's education, and there's the latest international development strategy gave our priorities as humanitarian, women and girls, British investment partnerships, climate and nature. They're explicit. Nature is not part of climate, is not hidden under green. It's nature explicit in there. So that's a big gain for us. And also global and health. So within this, there is this commitment of 11.6 billion pounds as climate finance that the government made over the next, well, between 21 and 26, I was going to say over the next 5 years. One year has been lost because of COVID lockdown and all that. But anyway, so we have this ambition. And within that, we have 3 billion pounds. It has to be about poverty reduction. It's all the money. It has to be about climate. So we need to completely maximize this mitigation, the adaptation, the building resilience to climate offer. And then we need to make this about nature. So this 3 billion pounds is our real big opportunity to demonstrate how can you deliver nature so that it supports the triple wins, which we know are not automatic, which we know will not just happen because we wish them. So we know that we need to work on these drivers. We know that we need to go and work on the direct NbS, do the implementation, but there's all of these big drivers that we are also very keen on engaging on. So I'm just going to mention some really interesting programs that we have. Some of them are ongoing, some of them are on our pipeline, some of them I won't be able to mention directly by name, but I'll just give the gist of what we're doing. So we have the Rada Program, which is this reversing environmental degradation in Africa and Asia. I managed to remember all. Many of you will remember the ESPA program that took place over about 8 years, and it was this big research on ecosystem services and poverty alleviation. Rada comes following on that and is trying to take this research into action. So we have John Hassel here, who leads on this Rada program. Fantastic work, highly recommended to follow that up. We have the JRT, the Just Rural Transition Program. This is really important for agriculture because what that program does is look at the macro level, the context, and working with governments, working with multilaterals to really accelerate this repurposing of harmful subsidies. We know it's really difficult to talk about just phasing out subsidies. It's not a tasteful conversation when you have a lot of powers in countries, but it makes it more palatable when you talk about repurposing. So that's the conversation that we are trying to focus on. We have a big, strong ambition that to change at least $10 billion as repurposed subsidies from agriculture, harmful subsidies, into good things for agriculture and water. So just keep your eyes on this space. It was announced at COP and it's going to be implemented very soon. We have another program that is being developed on water security. That's another one, fantastic program. And these water people have been working a lot during COPs. You know, the water pavilion was the first year we had work on that. So this is taking forward some of this work on water, increasing the transparency, the governance across supply, demand, and really importantly, let's take it back into the watersheds. So we join it together, all of these agendas. We have this announced last week, the week before, at the UN Ocean. We announced the COAST program, and let me remember the name. It's called Climate and Ocean Sustainability Transition Program. We forced it to make it fit with COAST. But COAST is basically the FCDO program that delivers under the Blue Planet Fund commitment of the overall fund is £500 million over 5 years. COAST, we're going to be implementing that. There's quite a lot of millions as well. And it's going to be working in coastal habitats, but really important element of food security. So we're going to be retaking smaller scale fisheries. We're going to be retaking the coastal habitats, so the mangroves, the corals. What do we do? How can we shift aquaculture from this business as usual and moving it into something more exciting and more climate friendly? How do we maximize these links with mangroves as well? We have another program that we're developing just now on nature-based solutions. So that, again, is going to be really bringing a focus directly on adaptation. And the very important element in here, we want to work with least developed countries, which is usually and more often a forgotten area. We also want to look at other ecosystems besides trees. So trees would be part of that, but we want to look beyond that as well. So these are just some of these really exciting programs for which we remain hopeful. And within this, well, you've seen this figuring here. We have, of course, the biodiversity, the specific biodiversity programs. We have the forestry programs. There's been quite a lot of them. There was some conversation yesterday from the International Forest Unit. But water and agriculture play a very important role to deliver nature. So it's part of our agenda. Another really important thing. So 3 billion is a lot, but it's very little. You divide that and you allocate that and divide by years, and it's very little. So at the moment, you can't quite see in here, but this is the ICF money. So the 11.6 billion of that sort of tag as nature, it's this bit in green. So there's some for mitigation, some for adaptation, and then there's other sectors as well. So we have resilience, we have cities, we have transport. This is just the climate funding. What we want is to see nature across into that as well. We want to mainstream it into those sectors that are about climate. So how can we increase this ambition? Not because nature is pretty, although it is, but because nature is important. We're talking about the risks, the exposures. We really want to bring in all of this TNFD language into overseas development assistance and our engagement with these governments and with the multilaterals that we work with. And beyond this, beyond the climate money, this 11.6 billion over 5 years, we want to go all over the rest of the overseas development assistance. So 11 billion pounds delivered every year, a lot for humanitarian, a lot for other things. What is happening? These countries where we work, how are they exposed to climate? What is happening with climate, and what role can nature play to increase this capacity to build adaptation and resilience to future changes? So, within this, sorry, just get very excited about this. There's a lot of actions that we're taking internally. So this is internal looking agenda that we have to shift the way that we look at our programming. So first we need to improve the capacity of people. So what is nature? How do you use it? How do you bring it into your programming? So we have our nature learning journeys that are internal, general. We have this economics for nature learning journey as well, where we're trying to bring in this, how do you bring this, all of the points that were made in the previous session, how do you bring that into the development agenda? We are really improving the way we mark and report our programming. So what we want to do is that with the PROF rules, the implementation rules, we managed to get this do no harm for nature as built in all new bilateral ODA is going to do no harm. So there's been an agreed element, very important in there. So what we need to do is now promote, what does it mean? So what we're meaning here is a new programming has to be ambitious, needs to consider climate and environment and nature, how will it be affected by your program? We need to understand the safeguards. We need to make programs to be transparent. What happens if you have safeguards but you don't follow them? What happens if there's failure? Who is going to be affected? You need to be transparent and you need to be able to report these effectively in your programming so that we can see as an organization what is happening. So this is linked again to all the ICF3 indicators, KPIs, all of this work is how do you aggregate from the very small program all the way up? And then, sorry, I'm just going to continue because I'm running out of time. Did the next one? So well, one of the other really important areas in which we work is increasing international ambition to shift this system. So we are cleaning our house internally, we're increasing putting the money where we are saying that it matters, and then we're trying to shift this. We're talking to other donors. Can you do something like that? We are engaging with other multilaterals as well. So at COP26, we managed to get commitments from 9 multilateral development banks to agree to begin talking about how they are going to be building nature into their programming. So sometimes these are baby steps. Andrea was really good yesterday talking about all of this diplomacy. So I'm not going to be talking much about that. But it is really important to just to say these are really important areas. We had COP26 just passed. We are transferring now, moving to COP27. In between, we have all of these commitments that we make that we need to deliver. We need to push others to also deliver the commitments they made. We have all the work with the G7, the G20, and we just want to really embed these systems into the international space. And so I'm going to stop there. I don't know how I'm doing for time. And the diplomatic engagement, I would really just like to refer back to Andrea's presentation yesterday. And thank you very much. The last thing, sorry, I have like 30 seconds. Asks for you. So you probably have a lot of questions for us, but we also have questions for you. So we came here with a lot of interest and expectations. We really want to ask, how can you help us aggregate? We need to deliver at a scale up. We need the go from the small level where we know that the context is context specific and all of this, but we need to aggregate that. And yesterday there was a lot of talk about aggregating, making into one sellable program. So how can we do that without losing that granularity that we need to deliver biodiversity and nature and for local people? So how can we do that? The other one, we really need more evidence from least developed countries on poverty, on climate and nature, those 3 elements in here. And I know that nature is about many things. So we also saw many indicators for biodiversity. So you can keep making it longer and longer, but we need to have to boil it down again to what happens to people, to climate, to nature. Well, I have a lot of other questions in here. What are the most effective ways to de-risk? How can we use this order, the little and the precious little order money that we have to help de-risk investments? What's the most effective way? And how can we do work on urban cities, peri-urban, especially in least developed countries, using nature-based solutions as a way to come in here? So that's me. Thank you.
Without further ado, let me ask Dr. Porras if you can find your seat, and I'd like to welcome co-chair and colleague from the Nature Conservancy, the Global Climate Adaptation Director, Danielle Morchain, who will be serving as moderator and helping us reflect on the opportunities and challenges of mobilizing commitments and collective action to achieve scale for nature-based solutions to deliver on water and food security outcomes. I'd welcome to you, Danielle, and invite back the panelists here to come onto the stage.
Thanks for your patience, first of all, to listen to our great talks, but still, it's a lot to ask from you. So now we'll go for the next part of the session to really take in questions, both from you here live and people also live but online. So please do get ready. We also are monitoring right here the online questions, so do keep them coming. Let's probably what we can do is one from around here, one from there. But let me start then with the first one, and I hope that, yes, our 3 virtual panelists are there as well. I wanted to start, I mean, anyone can really address this question, but I'd like to, perhaps particularly Susan and Nandita, start with you because you, in your talk, you mentioned Nandita, the need to figure out the key trade-offs associated with wetland restoration in your case. And Susan, you talked about the need to evaluate impacts of nature-based solutions on food production. So that's also something I've been hearing across the sessions here from day one, in terms of, there are so many trade-offs when it comes to understanding the benefits, perhaps the challenges of nature-based solutions. But from your point of view, what does this mean? Does this mean that we don't quite fully move into nature-based solution implementation full throttle? That there has to be a lot more research before? Maybe it's a both and. But what is the message? I mean, Nandita, you talked about the need that you're going to do some more research. You put some questions there already. But I wonder, in a political momentum when there's a strong push also to implement, and that's also a really good sign, are you also saying, but we have to hold back? Or if not, what is the message?
Thanks. That was a really good question. I think this is true about environmental challenges broadly. There is always more to learn, but learning has to happen parallelly with implementation. It cannot be sequential. And there is a lot we know already. I mean, so with wetlands, for example, we know that wetland restoration has benefits from groundwater recharge, from water quality improvement, from flood protection. All of this is known, and so implementation should follow parallelly. But I think also we need to understand the trade-offs. So for example, when we were looking at trade-offs between water purification and methane emission from wetlands, it was interesting because there were very few studies that actually measured both together. Right? So how do we quantify a trade-off if at the same location you're not measuring the two together? So I think in some ways there are ways to come at estimation without some of these numbers. And with those estimates, we have to move forward with implementation, but at the same time, we need to really evaluate and appreciate these trade-offs when we are engaging in implementation.
Thank you, Nandita. I wonder, Susan, if you wanted to comment, and other panelists, but maybe give the word to you first.
Yeah, so I come from a research background. I used to work with the World Agroforestry Center before I moved to ICRAF, to WRI. And within ICRAF, we developed this paradigm that is called research in development, embedding research in development, primarily because we realized that a lot of good science doesn't necessarily get into the development space, and it doesn't even worse, sometimes get into the local community and decision-making policy space. And so my short answer is no, we cannot wait to do, because we've been doing research anyway. And to agree with Professor Nandita is that, yes, there's already a lot of research that exists there that can help us to get started, that can help us to do things right. One thing is that we are not looking into that research even before we design programs adequately. There are a lot of times, as I mentioned, programs around tree planting that have not taken time to look at what are the best practices in tree growing, what kind of tree species should be growing where and for what functions. Sometimes we get carried away in terms of, we want to plant 1 trillion trees. And so the goal is to plant trees and the goal is to sequester carbon. And we forget to look at what trees should be growing where and for whom, and what kind of trade-offs we should be expecting. So I think the sweet spot is actually getting research into development space, working with development actors, working with local communities in order to learn as we are going, but also learn, sort of look at what already exists enough before we even start moving. So, and let me just mention that another risk that we've seen is sometimes some of the ecosystem services that come from nature-based solutions, can be competing with the others. So for instance, carbon has a global demand. And so there's tendency for nature-based solutions to focus on that, because obviously there's demand for carbon, they demand to buy carbon. Other ecosystem services may not necessarily be sold, may not be traded. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that even as we are doing research and even as we are trying to manage the trade-offs, that sometimes there will be strong signals of demand that may undermine other ecosystem services as equally important, but just because they don't have a price value, a dollar value, may not necessarily be getting a bigger push like the others.
Yeah, thanks, Susan and Nandita. And yes, I'll pass it on to you. I also want to say, like, for the sake of the having a diversity of questions, maybe let's not have an answer from everyone for each question, no? But yeah, of course, you're very welcome to comment on it. And thanks for the feedback. I think also that point on research and development together is key. Ina? Yeah.
Does my microphone work? Good. Yes, I think that we need the two things, but more than just research, we need to really understand this political context in which we're going to be implementing. So the approach that we're taking, just to mention one of the programs that we are developing at the moment on nature-based solutions, is that yes, we need to scale up. Yes, we can't wait anymore. We really need to go and work. But what it means, it's a combined approach. We need to go and support countries, implement their ambition. They are preparing their NDCs, they're preparing all of these plans. So we're going to be supporting them do that. But we're going to also step back and really understand this systemic, invest in the systemic, the governance issues, the enabler systems that will really allow these activities to remain in the future. We've seen a lot of similar with anyone who has worked in payment for ecosystem services for the last 20 odd years is aware of the many really well-meaning small interventions that never went anywhere. So we really need to go back and understand this political context and work on it, but also go and implement.
Thanks, Ina. Maybe we'll leave it at that, but also, so let's take a couple of questions from the audience. But meanwhile, because you haven't seen James, really, he didn't give a presentation, he's here as a panelist. Maybe I'll give you also a chance, James, to introduce yourself. James Allen from Olab, the lab.
Yeah, thank you very much, Danielle. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So I work as a facilitator in Brazil on deforestation linked to soy and beef. And I think, sort of touching on the point around research, I think the research is there, particularly on the relationship between forests, water resources and food security. The research is there. I think the big challenge in a place like Brazil is how do you translate that research so it gets out to the people that are actually going to respond to it, particularly farmers and producers in Brazil. What I think you see in a place like Brazil is actually a lot of mistrust of the research, right? So there's a sort of sense in which the research is being sort of teed up to meet a specific end. And so I think how that research lands is really, really important. And so through which particular voices it lands, how do you use farmers and producers themselves to talk to research? So it's the who, it's the how, it's what means do you use to get the research out there. And I think there's some really interesting cases now of actually getting progressive farmers in Brazil, farmers who are thinking about what farming looks like in 20, 30 years, to be the voice pieces, so to be the people who are actually bringing new research on nature-based solutions and other approaches to their peers through videos, through WhatsApp, through other kind of means. And I think that's kind of a really interesting frontier that I think the research community needs to be asking those questions. How does this land amongst the people that are actually going to use the research?
Thank you, James. Thanks very much. Over to you. We have a question online, but and we'll also ask about that one. But please hear from the audience. Let us know if you have any questions or comments. Okay, so here's one. Here's the first one.
Thank you. Astrid Agostini from the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. Thank you very much to all your interventions. I have a very general question when it comes to nature-based solutions in agriculture, and I'd be interested in your views on how far nature-based solutions in agriculture are basically sustainable agriculture. I mean, is there anything else that we need to think about beyond the broad concepts and the many years of good practice analysis on sustainable agriculture with multiple benefits? And is NbS something else than simply a lens to look at what solutions are particularly, or what agricultural practices, approaches, also at the landscape level, of course, not just at the plots level, would be particularly appropriate, depending on some hierarchy of objectives that may exist, be it on a policy or at the landscape level through some multi-stakeholder process. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We could take another one still, or we leave it for the second round, but please raise your hand if you'd like, and also people upstairs. We can see you from here. Okay, let's take these two, because there's that really key question. And online, we have another key one that I think, well, for you, Mauricio, and for others as well, but certainly for you from Denis Vasiliev. Denis asks, could you expand a little bit on ways of implementation of landscape scale ecosystem-based adaptation through NbS in the context of agricultural land? So you were talking in that last or next to last slide, Mauricio, when you showed, there's like 3 levels, and the third one was really the landscape approach. So if you could address that, how is that done? That I think you called it also. I made a note of that. The intensive or pastoral system. So if you could address that and others as well, the question from the colleague from FAO.
Okay, so if you hear me in a moment, I think I can address your question. I mean, call it what you want. Call it sustainable, regenerative, whatever you want. For me, in the end, is the impact. Are we having a positive impact on water, biodiversity, carbon, soil health? You have a dung beetle there. How do we have more biodiversity in soil as well, for example? Is that happening? But also, are people better off? Are they more resilient when they produce? Are their systems more resilient? And finally, are they making better margins? Not just making barely, so they have to produce much more over more land to make it in the end. So call it, I don't care about the name. We call it regenerative for now, and that's our strategy. We were choosing that name. There's 250 definitions out there of regenerative. 250. For us, it's important at the end, what is the impact? Can we put it all together into an index like that or something that we can tell, are people making progress? But I wouldn't stick to naming. That labeling is important. But I think the thing is that many researchers and institutions are gaining a lot of progress in different areas. Can we put this all together into one thing that makes sense and is more integrated? And for us, the social aspects are crucial. People have to be better off. If not, it's going to be just a nice story to tell. And the scaling for us it's essential. I'm going to use the scaling maybe for the landscape question. It is a good question. I mean, we're talking about big landscapes. The Chaco is just 100 million hectares, for example. It's a huge landscape. That's the size of Colombia, where I'm from, more or less. So it's a big landscape. The way we're approaching this is we're creating core areas of work where you have maybe 100,000s of hectares, but you can work with a coalition of farmers or ranchers or associations to demonstrate. You have to demonstrate this on the field with a certain scaling mechanisms there. I don't know whoever knows Argentina, but there's grupos CREA, they're farmer-to-farmer kind of relationships, and they learn among themselves. We want to create more of those, but that's a fierce scale. You have to show things work at that level. Second is you have to have that platform. So who is active in that landscape? Is it INTA? Who are the organizations that are crucial for you to work with that are going to bring that learning to other areas in the same bigger landscapes or other landscapes? And who is then a regional player? Are these, I'm not going to mention companies by name, but major companies are players in several countries. Can we work with a big meat company that wants to go sustainable or regenerative? And that whatever they do in the Chaco, they will do also in the Magdalena Valley in Colombia, and they will also do this in the lowlands of Peru. That's sort of the scale, but we have to maintain that integrity, that it's going to be restoration, conservation, and production at the landscape level. You measure at the farm level. Of course, you want to see how things are going there, but that's would be sort of the approach.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Mauricio. I wonder if other colleagues want to comment on it. And Sophie, I'm looking at you because I know yours is more focused on, as I understand, on water, but I wonder if there's also connections to agriculture, and in that sense, that integration of water and food, and not just water security and food security, but the two sectors, whether there's some lessons the Norfolk work has to offer.
Yeah, I mean, effectively the objectives, the prioritization are focused on water security benefits, of course, measuring co-benefits in terms of biodiversity or carbon. But the interventions that we're looking at are mostly land-based and therefore implemented by farmers, right? And we are in a context in the UK where there is a lot of emphasis on effectively moving away from agricultural subsidies, which are focused on productivity under the Common Agricultural Policy, to subsidy regimes where it's paying farmers to produce public goods. So, you know, moving towards more of an ecosystem services-based approach. So this, you know, is at the heart of what is being done. There's several issues, I would say. One is the capacity of farmers. So we are working with very advanced farmers who understand the complexity of biodiversity net gain and how they could mobilize funding out of this type of offsets from biodiversity or from soil, etc. But it's obviously not the case for all farmers, right? So there is a need for disseminating this learning from one farmer group to another, and this is one of the key objectives and what we're currently doing with this Norfolk hub to do that on a locality base, but could be expanded to the rest of the UK. And then, I mean, the link with food production, one of the key issue that is coming up is competition of the land, right? So I was interested to hear, you know, when Nandita was talking about the fact that we're not talking about taking vast swathes of land away from agriculture, yet in a region like the UK and East Anglia in particular, where there is not that much land to go about, it's creating definitely some concerns about whether or not the UK will be able to produce enough food if we are taking away land from production, particularly in the context of a discussion of nutrient neutrality, where one of the key intervention would be to take land, to withdraw land from production or to reduce the use of fertilizers. So I think there's definitely, whether it's real or not, we haven't yet measured this, but it is creating tension at the political level, which is the dimension, of course, that has been mentioned that needs to be taken into account. So it's politics, but also political economy needs to be managed in order to make these solutions work. And that's why governance is so important, having the right type of governance structures to work through these potential conflicts.
Thanks very much, Sophie. I wonder if someone else from the panel here would like to comment on that part of integration and scaling. If you would, then by all means. No.
So perhaps I could just make a comment about what successful landscape implementation looks like. I think landscape interventions are different on two levels. I think the first is that they have to be locally owned. So having, you know, people who live in those landscapes at the heart of the solution is kind of key to it. And I think the other difference about a landscape approach is that it's holistic, right? So it's not just about natural resources or biodiversity. It's about livelihoods as well. It's about kind of thinking much more broadly about social development, education, and other factors as well. And I think those two come together. So what I've seen in Brazil, kind of what works in terms of you know, guaranteeing those two elements is bits that we often miss. So it's like a really good, the word works better, I think, in Spanish and Portuguese. It's a diagnosis, right? So a really good situation analysis. So understanding, like, what is this landscape? And getting local people to design the kind of future that they want for that landscape. So that really good situation analysis. Establishing governance structures as well, I think, is key. So that's where the ownership piece comes in. And then investment. So off the back of that plan and the back of that governance, you actually have significant investment and the ability to scale, and then you deliver off the back of that. So that's kind of what I think we've seen work in Brazil. And when you miss one of those stages, it often doesn't work out.
Okay. Great, thanks, James. Over to you again, but actually I want to take a little change of pace here and ask a question to you. Then others can comment here, but we'll give you the priority. And a lot of what we're talking, you know, these kind of solutions take a long time, right? Some are a bit faster, but if we're especially talking about landscape and about scaling, we're talking here a good number of years. Even the 2026, 28 objective, it starts to feel tight in terms of time. So imagine we're in 2040 right now, and someone who is probably 15 or 18 asks you, what is it that ask you to tell them the story of nature-based solutions in the 20s and 30s. So you have to go back to them and tell them it was a wonderful thing, it changed, revolutionized everything, or the opposite, like you were saying from FAO, the colleague there, it's what's new, what's in the name. So if that young person asks you, what happened in the 20s and 30s with NbS? Did that really, live up to its expectations or not? Who would dare explain to them 20 years from now? It's also open to folks here, but it would be great because we're all experts of some sort in, okay, we have a volunteer here.
Sorry, Michael Cherry. I'm sorry to harp on the same thing as this morning, but I think the answer to that question depends on whether in the United States and Europe, Ed Barber's suggestion this morning is followed or not. So if in the United States and Europe, you could abolish all nature-harming agricultural subsidies and redirect all those funds towards nature-based solutions, the impact on a global scale would be fine, because of the phenomenon of globalization, countries that have already abolished those subsidies are discriminated against in terms of cost, because you can simply import them. And so I think that's where the onus is on people in the United States and Europe to lobby for that.
Okay, so that's a big structural change in that respect. So that's a good call. Any other takers? Okay.
Thanks. I guess the way in which I view this is that the concept of nature-based solutions more explicitly brings and is effectively like a catch-all term for valuing and recognizing ecosystem services. And so we go towards natural capital stocks and flows. And I think that it's a useful concept as when we engage policymakers and businesses, it allows them to, by taking this integrated nature-based solutions approach, they start to think, okay, nature, oh wait, nature's related to climate, it's related to water provision, it's related to welfare and providing economic opportunities, and therefore provides a channel, an entry point to start thinking about valuing and accountability from everyone in society around the externalities that nobody actually takes in consideration of currently. And so I think the concept of nature-based solutions combined with natural capital accounting approaches and then improved accountability and regulatory and investor scrutiny and engagement is a really powerful tool for then broader changes in how we manage resources globally and what we value. And so that I think that for me is the interesting kind of thought process, which I think can really has the opportunity to lead to a much more sustainable future.
Thank you very much, and thank you, sir. Thank you both, gentlemen. I consider myself a pretty smart 15-year-old, but still I'm a little bit confused by these complicated explanations. So I hope the lady in the back with the pink blouse will help me understand it more simply.
So you're a young person, yeah?
Yes.
Okay.
15.
You're a bit far. Okay, you need to get it out and advocate. You need to use your power and your voice as a citizen to your government, and you need to use your buying power as a consumer. So you need to influence the private sector companies. You need to, put pressure for the financial system to change. I think we've got to get valuing nature and nature risk critically on a par with putting climate risk at the center of all our decision making, and we need to see those two things as integrated in all our financial and economic choices. We need to shift the way that food systems work. We need to shift the way that finance works. We need to shift the way that infrastructure invests. We haven't even begun to talk about energy, which of course is the other big shift, and the role of natural capital in underpinning energy. And we need good research and evidence. And I've just had a crazy idea, which I think we should get some VR headsets that take our politicians into the future and show them what a 2-degree, 4-degree plus world actually looks like, and transport them around the world. And if anyone watches Your Home Made Perfect, we could call it Your Planet Not Made Perfect.
There we go. I love the crazy ideas, and yeah, this kind of, we have to think perhaps along those lines to get it happen, to make, you know, to get to where we want to be. So there's a lot of information here, what we need to do, what we need to get to, and so let me now bring it back to our panelists to say, well, that's maybe what we need to do. But remember, now we're in 2040, and we are trying to reflect on what was done in the 20s and 30s. So, for example, were those, you know, is it feasible? Is it realistic? I don't know, maybe not feasible. Is it realistic that those agricultural subsidies would be changed or eliminated? You know, what when we look back 20 years, you know, what is the legacy by then of this? Of the efforts that we're trying to promote, thinking of yours, Ina, for example, you know, if all of that really happens, you know, then what is it really the impact and the opportunities that nature-based solutions is offering, all things considered, considering also, you know, the major questions we're having to ask ourselves around food security, for example, these days. No? So I don't want to push too far the questions, and please do come in with others. But yeah, that's I think a little bit more the context of where what is important to think about in thinking about then the implementation phase, the big rollout of nature-based solutions. So over to any comments or I wonder if there's something that you would like to offer.
I mean, a comment that I would make, Danielle, is if we're sitting here in 2040 and looking out at this audience and, you know, what's changed, I think the people looking back at us will include farmers. So farmers will be at a nature-based solutions conference, and they'll be prosperous farmers. And, you know, prosperity is a good word, right? So there'll be smallholder farmers, there'll be large farmers as well. You know, I'm curious as to whether, you know, there has to be consolidation or whether nature-based solutions can happen at small scale. But I think there'll be farmers that have seen nature-based solutions as a business opportunity. And again, that can sometimes sound like a dirty word in a space like this, but it has to make economic sense, right? And so I think we'll be looking back and the farmers will be saying, yes, so we bought into some of these nature-based solutions. They brought prosperity to our communities, and there's been growth and positivity as a result.
Thanks, James. Yeah. Ina, did you want to?
Yes, and maybe for this answer, I'm going to change my hat. So I'm going to bring out my Costa Rican credentials. So I'm from Costa Rica. 30 years ago, when I was, let's say, around 15, Costa Rica had a really high deforestation rate. It was really the landscapes I was growing up, I was used to, were denuded hills, mountains. We would be going from my hometown, which is on the Pacific, over to San Jose, and it was just mountains, mountains, mountains. And that was just the trajectory. You see that trajectory in other countries that were experimenting exactly the same thing. So what happened then? What happened? There were lots of things that happened. Meat markets crashed, and there were a few other crises that made deforestation a little bit more difficult. But then there were also really crazy actions that were taken. So I go back to the 1995, 96 discussions when the new forestry law came in and made all deforestation illegal, all deforestation of primary forest and kind of settle, I don't know what the actual name is, of secondary, advanced secondary forest. It made it illegal. So yesterday we saw in Brazil, you have the legal, you have the illegal, and it's very difficult to measure. This was kind of, okay, everything is illegal. And of course, everybody shouted and everybody was angry. But that's what it was. And then it made it illegal. It put the red light. And then it, at the same time, it introduced a payment for ecosystem service, which was not perfect at all. And it was introduced when everybody said this will never, ever work. This is crazy. But it was introduced as an incentive to say, okay, you have the choice to break the law or you can get this incentive. And it just began to change the mentality of people. Actually, okay, we're going to try it, we're going to test it. And it began to be rolled out, and with many skeptics, and thinking that there was no way we were going to be able to keep this rolling. We had the fuel tax, it was earmarked, it went into the budget, the general budget, and it was a nightmare to get it out. But civil society fought. We were young at the time, we went to the streets, we fought for it. We put the government to answer for the constitutional right to a safe environment. We just fought for it. And you go to Costa Rica and people like to see what it is now and say it's impossible, it's too whatever, it doesn't apply. But it is this big process. And it began when the ones that are now here, we were 15 at the time, and it changed, and it's possible to change. So that's what I would like to tell 15 years old now. Just go and do it.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Ina. I also wanted to, our panelists who are online, also, if you want to come in at any time, just I can see you from here too. So just let us know. So thanks for those reflections so far. Open again to you to continue the dialogue. Yes, we have a comment or a question here.
Hello, I'm Eva Hernandez from WWF. It's great to listen to you, and it's great to see all the good things that we can do with nature-based solutions. But I also have a fear, it's that we die of success. So imagining for example, the example that Mauricio presented on regenerative agriculture, I'm thinking of the modernization of irrigation systems and how by thinking only at a certain scale, you think you can improve, you can save farmers from water scarcity. But if you increase efficiency in all the farms, then at the end you don't have enough water. So do we have the risk that by promoting good farming practices, we end up transforming all the forest because it's good farming practices? But you also mentioned that it's about conservation. So how do you cap it? How do you put a maximum surface of NbS? So considering that by shifting incentives, subsidies, you can shift all the farming to NbS, but then it has to have a maximum while the population of the planet keeps on growing, and moreover, the demand of consumption, the consumption level continues increasing.
I think that's a wonderful question. And to the panelists, I would add an extra angle, if I may, that is around, and what would happen to those farmers in this case that are probably unable to move to that innovation space, for let's say, poverty-related reasons. So I think that's an important challenge, important consideration, and so whoever wants to take that on, you're very welcome. Mauricio, if you want to start, and I think Nandita, what did you? Yeah. So
Nandita can do.
Let's start with you, Nandita.
No, Mauricio, start. I'll go after.
Okay. So it's a great question. I mean, and we always get this. If you have a rancher in the Amazon doing so well with silvopastoral system, he or she is going to open more land to do more money, to get more funding, leakage, whatever you call it. But we have looked into that data that I showed you, 4,000 ranchers, for example, over 10 years of data. People stick to what they have. Even people we worked then in Nicaragua with a RESCA, you can look it up, RESCA program in different countries in Central America. What people have is once you have your land and you make it more efficient, people tend to either make with what they have, you can create more inputs, more outputs, more produce, but they don't start to now buy land all over the place and get industrial. That's the data we have from different projects in different countries. But I would say in general terms, if you shift everything that is mainstream agriculture, or a lot of that, a big piece of that, into regenerative, sustainable, I mean, everything that has better goals in the end, if you are able to do a shift, a big portion of that, what would be not the constraints, but the guidelines is we have to use that area that is under degraded pasture land. We have programs in Brazil, the Regenerative program, you might know this, working with new areas for soy in this case on degraded pasture lands. That should be the expansion in the future. Reverte still has to work, but it's working on regenerative systems as well, not just the expansion, but the conditions on how that expansion should happen. And that is where you have to have, for me, it has to be with four things. You have to have the right science and knowledge sharing between farmers and ranchers, but also the industry. You have to have the right business models. I mean, how do you get then your produce to the market? How do you incentivize that? But you have to have the right policies. How do you create an umbrella that protects but also guides the sector? How to create those either limitations or some of the rules of the game, if you will, if this becomes so successful that it grows too much. And then the last bit that is essential for us, obviously, and that may be the worry, but you have to, if you want to transition from mainstream agriculture or ranching to regenerative, it is costly. Our data is between $500 and $2,000 per hectare, depending on what you choose, intensive, not intensive. Not everybody has that kind of funding. If you have 100 hectares, 50, 1,000. So the last bit has to be funding. You should be able to get the right credits built for those kinds of systems. We need 3 or 4 years to get return on that investment to be able to pay back. And that has to be together with the right sort of insurance, climate parametric insurance. But that funding has to be conditioned. If you want this money, this is how the things should work. There's a CELI, I know you're going in Africa working through that, and I'm going to finish. But there's an example on how you condition credit lines and how do you make those links with producers. But
thanks, Mauricio, and sorry for cutting you, but I realize the time, and we have still Nandita and Susan. But before I give you the word and recognizing we have 5 minutes left, I wanted to bring up this question. Maybe you can incorporate in your thought and your answers from Penny online, who says that what has been missing in discussions over the conference is the impact on human health. And we all know that health is a big driver for conservation. She'd like to hear from the panelists whether they have thought about the human health implications of NbS, whether good or bad, beyond food and water security. So if you have some reflections on health, Nandita, Susan, that would be great for us to hear. Thanks.
Thank you, Dennis. So I'll jump in and say the first thought that came to my mind with the question is the ideas around Javon's paradox, which Professor Garrick is an expert on, that when you increase irrigation efficiency, you see more and more land being brought into high water requiring agriculture. And I mean, broadly, I think the word cap is really important in this case, and thinking about, and this is why I like to talk always about trade-offs. So thinking about nature-based solutions as a win-win is probably not the best idea. There are situations where there are trade-offs in the landscape. For example, if you have a pond and many ponds in the landscape that is recharging the groundwater, you are reducing flooding downstream, and impact on of that can be positive, but also it can be negative because there are benefits that a downstream flood can create for you. So I think it's important to think about things in a holistic basin scale and really understand those co-benefits and trade-offs in the system, and put a cap and think about caps in that space. In the human health sphere, nature-based solutions, to me personally, health is what comes through air and water pollution, and there's nature-based solutions that address those. So when you're having different technologies like wetlands as a nature-based solutions that's causing cleaner water, that has health impacts because that water is used as a drinking water source, or similarly air pollution. That's the connection to the health aspect that I know. But also there is, of course, urban green infrastructure and the impact of that on mental health. That is another key piece.
Thank you, Nandita. Susan, last word from you.
So quickly, I'd like to reflect. There was someone in the audience who said how nature-based solutions would look like for US and for Europe. And I felt it is good to reflect as well to the 15-year-old how nature-based solutions would look like for Africa, because obviously we don't have problems of over-nitrification, we don't have problems of historical emissions in terms of carbon or even methane. Really emissions from Africa have been historically and currently lower. But in 2040, we have the fastest growing population, currently expected to double by 2050. And if nature-based solutions don't kick in, we risk having the same agriculture or food systems trajectory that we have seen in the US and in Europe. And there's a lot of push by a lot of input suppliers to move towards that, and a lot of undermining of nature-based solutions without sufficient evidence claiming that it could lead to decline in terms of agriculture productivity. So for Africa, it's being able to feed a growing population. We don't want to see numbers of 800 million people facing hunger, a majority of whom are located on the African continent. Even if nature-based solutions sequestered substantial amounts of carbon, but we are still talking about food security in Africa, it would be a massive failure. And so secondly, we would look at how do we make that happen? Pay farmers for nature-based solutions, for investing in nature-based solutions. A lot of nature-based solutions are knowledge intensive, they are labor intensive, but when farmers produce through those methods, they still have to compete in the market with products that have not produced sustainably. And so there's no incentive really to then invest in their knowledge and in their labor to invest in nature-based solutions. And secondly, let's be very honest in terms of the drivers of land degradation. Most of them are not necessarily located on the African continent. We all love our chocolate. Have we looked at the impact of cocoa on deforestation in the West African region? Have we looked at the demand of our consumption of other products, including timber that is coming from the Congo Basin, and how it's leading to deforestation? So really what I'm trying to say is we have to look at what are the drivers, external drivers, as well as those ones that are locally located. And in addition to that, pay farmers to invest their knowledge and skills and labor to really boost nature-based solution and increase their own food security.
Thanks so much, Susan. Appreciate that, and Nandita. So before we wrap it up, really, and thank our panelists, I have a very scientific experiment to run with all of us. In this session, it's been really about water security, food security, so the kind of the overlap, the relationship of nature-based solutions to people, to resilience, to adaptation, mitigation as well. So how are each one of us feeling about the potential of nature-based solutions to really address these issues in an equitable way and in a way that is inclusive and so on? So are we all, if we are very enthusiastic about it, like, yes, this is it, we can probably do this. And if we are, we can go a little bit down if we're less and less enthusiastic, and we can finish, like I'll do in a second, if we're really worried. So in the next few seconds, please let's each see how we feel, or show how we feel about this potential of nature-based solutions for resilience and adaptation and addressing the climate and biodiversity crisis. Wow, optimists, fantastic, great. Well, thank you all for participating. Thanks for the panelists. Thanks, Dustin, as well, for really all your work in the session. Thanks, everyone, for participating online and virtually. And really, thank you all for your engagement.